The strongest and oldest emotion is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft, 1938. Fear. When I was still a child, my parents lived with my older brother and me in an important city, in a large apartment building dating from the Gründerzeit. This was in the 1970s, more precisely from the mid-70s to the early 80s. My first memory of the apartment in that building may come from a time when I was 5 or 6 years old. Before that, my parents had lived elsewhere with us children, but I can no longer remember it. I remember the large television set running in the living room and the blue and white striped budgerigar named Piepmatz fluttering exuberantly through the kitchen over the grease-smeared pans on the stove, into which he would later once crash, though without lasting harm. The apartment was in the basement of the house. Nowadays, it would probably be described and rented out as a garden-level flat. Back then, however, it was simply called a basement apartment. The windows lay below ground level, and so, even in the brightest sunshine, it was always a little darker than elsewhere. Dusk began earlier than elsewhere, and staying there was more pleasant than elsewhere, even during unbearable summer heat, though this did not apply from early autumn until early summer. The air inside was so damp and musty that paper would curl after a while and take on the apartment's persistent, slightly stale smell. Often, to my considerable disgust, I had to share my room with woodlice, beetles, ants, mosquitoes, and unfortunately also spiders. At least I had my own room, and when I looked out of its large window, I looked directly at the neighboring house, perhaps 6 or 7 meters away. It was a strange building for 2 reasons. First, the small plain house, probably built in the 1920s, did not, as I of course only grasped intuitively at the time, fit architecturally with the massive, large, and above all much older houses in the neighborhood. Second, the little house somehow looked neglected, grimy, almost run down. When I looked from my window at that house, I saw its north side, where there were 2 windows on the ground floor, presumably belonging to a kitchen, and 3 windows on the first floor. I concluded that the 2 windows belonged to the kitchen, because sometimes one could hear crockery clattering or smell cooking when one or both windows were tilted open. Which room the 3 windows in the floor above belonged to, however, I never found out. No one in our home really knew who lived in the house opposite. I once asked my mother whether children lived there too, children I might play with, but she denied it with the brief explanation that this was probably not the case. A man lived there, but he was not someone one had anything to do with. I mention this house because of what I observed on a rainy afternoon in late summer 1979. At the time, I was sitting alone in my room, bored because I had no one to play with and did not know what sensible thing to do with myself. Having pulled the wicker chair up to the window, I stared without interest at the dense rain falling outside, which made the day gray. In my already dim room, it had become almost completely dark. Yet, I did not want to switch on a light. I did not need it. The monotony of the pattering rain had almost lulled my mind to sleep, when suddenly I thought I had made out a movement in the gray sameness out of the corner of my eye. I turned my gaze to the neighboring house, which looked even more shabby in the rain, where something seemed to have stirred. I saw that, in the middle of the 3 windows on the first floor, there was something hairy. I could not immediately tell what it was, so diffuse and indistinct was the appearance of this thing. Hindered by the veil of rain, I narrowed my eyes and stared at the peculiar tuft of hair or fur. Gradually, I thought I could make out some kind of doll or figure representing something like a monkey with very dense dark hair over its entire body. Only the white, pale face was entirely hairless and stood in visually inexplicable contrast to the dark rest of the figure. Unusually close, beneath the strikingly low hairline, a pair of eyes with a defiant look bulged out, and above the full red lips protruded a pointed, flat, far too long nose. I could not understand how any of it fit together. A shudder ran through me at the absurdity of the construction, and I hurriedly drew back from the window to run to my mother. She did not notice my fearfulness at all. So occupied was she with her everyday chores. I tried not to let anything show, because I did not want to be considered a scaredy cat. However, that evening I delayed going to bed longer than usual with flimsy excuses. When it could no longer be avoided, I asked my mother, under a pretext, to look out of the window with me so that I could show her something trivial. Only together with her did I dare to look out of the window, and to my great relief, the cruel construction of Punch's head and Monkey's body could no longer be seen, even though the lighting conditions would still have allowed it. Nevertheless, to my mother's astonishment, I demanded that she draw the curtains as far as possible. That night, at least, it helped me sleep calmly and deeply. In the time that followed, I looked every day. At first furtively, then increasingly resolutely, from my room at the windows opposite. The figure did not appear again, which gradually restored my usual sense of security. Of course, that did not mean it had disappeared from my thoughts. Rather, I was constantly preoccupied by questions such as why the figure existed at all and where it was now. Surely, no child would willingly want to play with this repulsive object. So why did this doll exist? Why had it been on the windowsill at all? Who had put it there? All these questions wound through my brain like a never-ending worm, gnawing away, little by little, at the relief I had initially felt over the absence of the thing, and leaving behind an unpleasant, oppressive form of not knowing. Nevertheless, over time, I somehow came to terms with this state of affairs, and accepted that I simply did not know more, and had no prospect of learning more than I already had. Perhaps, or even probably, people noticed all the same that I was in some way beside myself. In any case, my mother, who until then knew nothing of what I believed I had seen, began spending more time with me. She often read to me from books, and one of them has remained especially vivid in my memory. It was the novel Amphibian Man by the Russian writer Alexander Belyaev. My mother had obtained the book second-hand through relatives, since it was not readily available to us, and although it was neither a children's book nor explicitly a young adult book, she read it to me with great pleasure. That she considered it suitable nonetheless may have been due to the youthful age of the protagonist and a certain childlike naivete that the book exuded. In any case, the story of poor Ichthyander did not frighten me. Rather, it stirred my pity for him. For the famous surgeon Dr. Salvatore, who pursued his research and experimented with organ transplants on a lonely estate near Buenos Aires, one day implanted the gills of a shark into Ichthyander, an orphaned indigenous boy, and thus created an amphibian man. The strange being with enormous eyes and frog-like limbs terrified the inhabitants of Buenos Aires. They took the fishman for an ill-omened sea devil. My mother read from the book over several evenings before bedtime, and the story captivated me so completely that I even forgot the gruesome figure in the neighboring house. Soon I was sleeping again without the curtains having to be drawn. One evening in late autumn, Amphibian Man had long since been read to the end, and I had begun occupying myself with an animal book for children. I could not fall asleep. The weather was to blame, for outside a violent wind was blowing and tearing the trees to and fro, causing them to lose their last leaves. Furious rain splashed up dirt that flew against my window. The night was dark and wild. Everywhere something was moving and stirring. I lay in my bed in such a way that, if I turned my head to the right, I could look out of the window at the neighboring house. Rain lashed against it as well and rattled loudly at the lowered shutters on the ground floor. The 3 windows on the first floor, by contrast, were unprotected. Restlessly, I tossed and turned and simply could not find sleep. When at some point I turned from one side to the other for the umpteenth time, I opened my eyes and looked outside. There, I immediately noticed 2 yellowish glowing points. They must have been in the upper windows of the neighboring house, and they flickered restlessly. The brightness they emitted was so great that it even allowed the immediate surroundings to be seen, at least in outline. They cast their yellowish light onto dark fur and made a pointed nose protrude even more hugely than usual. It was the figure, then, on whose torso the yellow points functioned as eyes. I started and pulled the blanket up, trembling with fear as I tried to crawl beneath it. Meanwhile, the wind had grown even stronger and was shaking my window. Although I was terribly afraid, I paradoxically wanted to cast another glance at the doll. Carefully, I pulled the blanket down a little and peered fearfully up at the figure. At once, a terror of unknown magnitude shot through me. The thing's yellow eyes were moving. They were directed at our house and glided along the facade, seeming to search for something. For a brief moment, the glaring points lingered at one spot. Then, all at once, they fixed on me. It seemed to me as though its yellow light rested on me for an eternity, though in reality, it could only have been fractions of a second, because I immediately began to scream and storm out of my room. My parents and my brother, still watching television in the living room, stared at me as if I were a ghost when I came running in, shrieking, and threw myself onto the sofa beside my mother. "Boy, what on earth is the matter?" my father wanted to know, while my mother gently stroked my sweaty hair and spoke soothing words to me. I sobbed so violently that I could not manage to produce anything intelligible. Only gradually did I calm down again and then, disjointedly, told them what I believed I had seen. To the others it must have sounded very confused, as I already sensed while giving my account. But try as I might, I could not express myself more clearly. Thus, a pitying, "You only dreamed it," was inevitable. And when the rest of the family accompanied me back to my room against my initial resistance, there was nothing left to be seen outside of the sparkling pair of eyes. My mother did draw the curtains and leave the door to the hallway, where a light was on, open, but she also made unmistakably clear that she would under no circumstances comply with my wish to sleep in my parents' bed. Everyone has nightmares sometimes. You have to get used to that. For better or worse, I had to manage alone and, still frightened, pulled the blanket over my head as far as it would go. I did not sleep a wink that night. This time, it took longer until I recovered. My mother now stopped reading me fantastic stories. Obviously, she had come to the conclusion that reading Amphibian Man had not done me any good. There were now evenings, somehow fitting the autumnal season, when the whole family came together to play board games. At first, it was difficult for me to get involved because, in truth, it bored me. But at the same time, I also noticed that it did me good in the evenings to be in the easy company of my parents and my brother. No one spoke about my fears of the night, of being alone in bed, because they knew that I did not want to talk about them and that there was no talking to me about them under any circumstances. Yet I sensed that they would certainly have listened to me if I had been willing to reveal myself. Thus, day after day, week after week passed, and very slowly the fear abated again. I could fall asleep without pulling the blanket over my head, without waking at night and seeing the doll in the neighboring house. In fact, it had not shown itself again since that evening. Yet it was not the supposedly deducible insight that nothing had ever been there after all, for it had been, that made me less afraid, but rather the experience that the thing could also simply disappear again. This insight gained space and strength within me until that afternoon in mid-January 1980, when the snow was falling softly and dusk was beginning. I looked out of the window because I heard a sound. It was the typical call of a raven. I saw an especially impressive specimen of that species land on the windowsill on the first floor of the neighboring house. Snow crumbled down and fell silently to the ground. The bird creature looked curiously into the house, and only then did I notice that the window before it was completely open. The raven peered farther and farther inside until it paused and then abruptly jumped back. Something announced itself, came closer until I could see it. It was the dreadful doll. It was back and was slowly crawling onto the windowsill. I saw only the back of its head, but already I felt fear of a look into its ominous eyes. The raven had retreated only at first. Now, since the doll creature advanced no farther, it remained standing and openly scrutinized its counterpart. All movement had gone out of the figure. As if frozen, it now remained motionless in its place. This encouraged the raven beast to approach it, hopping, its head wobbling as it turned it this way and that in inspection when it was very close in front of the doll. Then the bird paused, only to drive its gray-black beak with full force into the figure's hairy torso. The figure trembled under the force of the blow, but the raven had only just found pleasure in it and struck the strange creature faster and harder with its powerful beak. What joy it gave me! At last there was someone who also recognized the depravity and repulsiveness of this creature and wanted to put an end to its tormenting reign of terror. Like clockwork, the blows and strikes rattled on. The doll merely took them and did not defend itself. It went on like that for half an eternity, until the bird gradually seemed to tire, no longer possessing the force and speed it had at the beginning. At the same time, it seemed as though it were becoming one with the figure, fusing with it. It was no longer possible to tell what was the bird's black plumage and what was the doll's black hair, black fur. The doll's dense hair seemed to grow over the raven and spin it in. The bird hardly moved now, as two hook-like projections grew out of the thing's legs, with which it additionally held its victim encircled. Painfully and inevitably, they bored into the raven's body, and it croaked loudly. That was enough for the doll. It clasped the pitiable creature in its arms and let itself fall with it from the windowsill onto the floor inside the house. I could still see only a few black feathers flying up and hear a brief, desperate croak that soon fell silent. My fear was back, more powerful and oppressive than ever before. This time I told my family everything, every detail of what I had seen. This time, the whole thing could not be explained as a dream or technically as an electronic toy with lights. This time, the reaction was different. Not a denial of what I reported, but a reduction of the account to a purely intrapsychic experience. Yes, we believe that you saw it, but it all happened only before your inner eye. True, and yet not true. It was psychologized, and at some point, my mother decided to take me to an appointment with the Municipal Educational Counseling Service. From then on, I began to dissimulate, to act as though I myself no longer believed what I had described, as though I had only been putting on an act for everyone in order to fool them. It was unspeakably hard for me to deny my memories. It felt as if I were denying a part of myself, and that hurt. But I knew that the conversations at the counseling center would lead to nothing. I preferred to accept further sleepless nights, which would eventually pass, rather than expose myself to a conversation that appeared open, but ultimately was not open at all. Believing me would have served no purpose. And so it remained at 2 or 3 meetings, which my mother finally broke off because of my obstinacy. Although she seemed annoyed, I sensed that she had an inkling that my claims that it had all only been a joke were not true. Again, weeks, indeed even months passed, without the malformed doll showing itself once more. I tried to swallow the fear before it did the same to me. That cost me a great deal of strength and concentration, made me more inhibited and less spontaneous, more tense, and left me appearing overall always a little downcast. In addition, I developed certain rituals, quasi-displacement activities, such as insisting that the things on my desk had to lie in a specific, immovable order. If anyone disregarded this wish for order, I reacted with unusual vehemence, no longer proportionate to the occasion, and could only be calmed with difficulty. My fears at night, however, I believed I had overcome. I am certain it was April 1, 1980, when I was at home alone in the afternoon after school. Outside, it was unusually warm that day, while in the apartment, the old cold of the past winter still lingered. I was sitting on my bed, reading a comic. I think it was The Red Flash, when the doorbell rang. My parents had never told me I was not allowed to open the door when they were not there. So I went unsuspectingly to the door and opened it. A tall figure stood before it. It was a man, older than I could imagine, very gaunt, dressed in a close-fitting, old-fashioned frock coat of heavy black fabric. His head was bald, his face pale and wan, oval in shape. A pointed nose jutted brazenly from it, almost as long as the man's thin, bony fingers. The old man scrutinized me openly with his black eyes. Then his expression darkened even more than it already had been. He raised his claw-like hand and said softly, "You have something that belongs to me." I felt fear and could not answer, because I did not even understand what the man meant. He pointed with his gnarled fingers to an object on the floor. Only now did I notice that there was a parcel there. "Give it to me. It belongs to me." I bent down and picked it up. Briefly, I recognized the name Anselm von Bühner on it. Silent and obedient, I handed the little package to the stranger. He accepted it, weighed it briefly in one hand, and then placed his other hand on my head. His long fingernails scratched my scalp as he ran them over it. Then he dug them painfully into my skull and finally tore out a few hairs before removing his hand from my head again. "I have found what I was looking for." Then he left and closed the door. The old man left me completely distraught. When my parents came home, they found me cowering fearfully in the corner, because when the door opened, I believed the old man had come back. They questioned me again and again about what had happened, what had taken place. But I owed them every answer. That night I had the first of those nightmares that would haunt me regularly in the years that followed, though not every night. I found myself in deepest darkness, in a jungle, on a kind of slope where a mighty tree stood. I squeezed myself beneath its gigantic buttress roots in the hope of being safe there from something abominable. I crouched in the cramped space between roots and mud-like earth, longing for the darkness to end soon. Wind shook the great tree ominously on the marshy ground and made it sway threateningly. Lightning illuminated the area between the roots and the ground. I saw the teeming realm of gigantic, ghostly insects, spiders, and reptiles. Then there was a dull impact on the ground, very close by, as if something had fallen or jumped from a great height. The ground smacked beneath the steps of the approaching thing. It stopped very near me, almost directly above me. At the same time, a rushing sound beneath me swelled to ever greater volume. Then the dream ended. I woke drenched in sweat, and usually did not immediately know where I was. This went on for several years, even after we moved out of the apartment into a home of our own in 1981. but I allowed no one near me. I wanted to know nothing of it. All the fear settled inside me like lime, making me stiff and joyless. I do not blame my parents. I tied their hands. More than that, they could not have done more than they did. I was simply obstinate. I fundamentally rejected outside help. At some point, perhaps 5 or rather 6 years later, I woke one morning from dreams that had not even been particularly restless. I did not yet notice the change in me, but something was different. It was a day of sun and clouds, with the moderate temperature I still like today. I was on my way to the school bus when I perceived something in myself, an unfamiliar lightness, a carefree feeling, no queasy sensation in my stomach as on every other morning, simply myself. It was the absence of fear. I soon realized that the nightmares had gone, apart from the ones everyone has occasionally. At the time, I gave no thought to what this might have been connected with. I was simply glad that everything was over. Only years later did I begin to consider what might have been the reason for the appearance and disappearance of that fear. It is reasonable to assume that it had something to do with the old man. His name had burned itself into my memory. Through time-consuming internet research, I later found out that Anselm von Bühner had indeed died at about the time my fears passed. He belonged to an old, widely branched, noble family that was part of the ancient nobility of Naumburg. As I learned, he had been stationed in the so-called Protectorate of Togo as a member of the Imperial Police Force at the outbreak of the First World War. He is said to have experienced terrible things there and to have returned to his homeland a completely changed man. Whatever it may have been that he saw there and that later caused him to haunt me in such a way, I bore no grudge against the man afterward, although I made an effort to do so. Rather, I felt a certain, I would not say pity, more a kind of compassion for him. For he carried his burden far longer than I did. That he passed it on to me was only fair.